Questions of much graver and universal interest occupy our minds today.
Hello, my name is Lieutenant Eric Shine. I'm a graduate of the United States Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point in New York. I'm a naval officer and federal maritime officer in the United States Merchant Marine. This is part 3 of 4 of a 4-part series on the U.S. Coast Guard and its current use of military tribunals and the history of the Coast Guard and the history of military tribunals here in the United States and abroad. This is something that does concern you because presently, the U.S. Coast Guard, under the Department of Homeland Security, is declaring itself to be a special branch of military, a branch of military in and of itself, within the Homeland Security Department, and is carrying on military tribunals of American civilians here in the United States. That is normally carried on under a military dictatorship or under military rule. We have just gotten into the Civil War at the end of part 2. And I will go back into a little bit about the Civil War because this is very important. One of the issues that came out shortly after the Civil War is posse comitatus that forbade the use of federal troops, especially the military, for police activity and especially to carry on any kind of tribunals or prosecution or investigation of civilians. This goes to our U.S. Constitution. No warrants shall issue without probable cause. The Civil War, although not the best example of just about anything due to the internal nature of this supposed war, that set countrymen against countrymen and family against family, if not even family member against members of their own family, similar to many events now transpiring here in the United States today. We have the issues of the red state and blue state, and you can see what's going on within politics and even the issues over the foreign wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Many people believe that with much of what is going on with certain sectors or groups, even using military tribunals against our own civilians, one of the core issues we are heading into discussion about, we believe that we are once again already within a new and contemporary civil war. That is something for an entirely different discussion at another time, but the information presented herein about the Coast Guard, Homeland Security, does lead us down that path. On April 11th, 1861, the revenue cutter Harriet Lane fired the first shots of the maritime conflict in the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. The cutter fired a shot across the bow of the Confederate steamship Nashville, an unarmed merchant ship, as it tried to enter Charleston Harbor during the bombardment of Fort Sumter. This same vessel functioned within the Confederate States Navy, and I'm talking about the revenue cutter. It was actually transferred over, captured by the South and used by the Confederate States Navy after its Treasury agents turned over the vessel to Southern concerns. This is also where the Revenue Cutter Service broke ranks to act as a civil service to even carry out in the first act of war against other American civilians here in the United States. Something that they seem to not have a problem with even today, almost 150 years later, where the U.S. Coast Guard, which is the stepchild of the Revenue Cutter Service and several other services that have more to do with civil service than a branch of military, are carrying on military tribunals of American civilians now here in the United States. The Revenue Cutters assisted Navy operations throughout the war. The U.S. RC, and RC is Revenue Cutter, Harriet Lane, joined a federal naval squadron to capture Forts Clark and Hatteras, which served as bases for Confederate blockade runners. USRC E.A. Stevens, a prototype 110-foot semi-submersible ironclad gunboat, participated in the unsuccessful sortie up the James River to Drury's Bluff in company with the USS Monitor, and many people remember that. It's one of the more famous, the Monitor and the Merrimack, two of the more famous ironclads, the USS Galena, and 2 other gunboats to attack Confederate capital at Richmond. After carrying President Lincoln from Washington on 9 May 1862, the USRC Miami assisted Navy transports in landing federal troops at Ocean View, Virginia. And President Lincoln ordered the Secretary of the Treasury on June 14th in 1863, you will cooperate with revenue cutters under your direction with the Navy in arresting rebel depredations on American commerce and transportation and capturing rebels engaged in therein. This was the first taste that the Revenue Marine, although under control of the U.S. Navy, would get of imposing itself as an arm or branch of military against fellow American civilians and enforcing military law upon other Americans. And it's important to note that up to this point, and for some time after, the revenue cutter Marine was, whenever it was used in a time of war, would always come under the U.S. Navy. So it would move as a civil service and into and under the control, the direct control of the U.S. Navy, which is a regular branch of military. The important point to note is that the U.S. Coast Guard is now claiming not only that it is a branch of military under Homeland Security, but it is a special branch of military that can override posse comitatus, that prevents it from getting into civilian law enforcement. There's more to this about the Civil War, but I want to get further up into this in 1915 when the Coast Guard was actually formed. When President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 15, 1865, the revenue cutters were ordered to search all ships for any assassins that might be trying to escape. Due to the Civil War and the violations of the Constitution and separation of powers doctrine in using the War Department against civilians, issues of what would become to be known as posse comitatus, and some of this also came out from Reconstruction, where the North used the military to impose itself upon the South as a police force, and shortly thereafter, Posse Comitatus Act was passed by Congress. The act passed by Congress to prevent the federal government from ever again using federal and especially military troops against other fellow Americans and especially civilians. It's important to note we pay our taxes to support the military, support defense, to protect all Americans, and it's not supposed to be used. There is a whole line of succession going from local to state, issues of like the National Guard, before we get into any issue of ever using federal troops, military troops, against our own civilians here in the United States. And this did happen down in the South after Katrina and Rita, the two hurricanes hit. And it's an important point because if we want to get to that, hopefully in this show, if not in show 4, where the Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, Vice Admiral at the time, Thad Allen, he's now the Commandant and Admiral of the U.S. Coast Guard, he is one of the individuals who ordered ground forces, military troops onto the streets in the South to be used against American civilians. An important Supreme Court case was decided shortly after the Civil War as well, and what was not only a seminal case on this issue of using military tribunals against American civilians, and is known as Ex parte Milligan. And I ask that you look it up. You can go to Wikipedia. The case is out there. And this is a ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court, one of many. There's also several from Vietnam, well, before that, from Korea and also Vietnam, and other times of a war or conflict where the military has tried to impose itself and control civilians here in the United States, not abroad. The case is central to the issues we are discussing and leading into which is the use of military tribunals by the Coast Guard. This is happening today, and Homeland Security against our own civilians. In Ex parte Milligan, it was held that military tribunals, and this is not just the issue of posse comitatus, which goes into policing, which is arrest, detain, and turn over to civilian authorities for a trial, for charges to be preferred or proffered. This goes beyond that because what's going on now is the Coast Guard is acting not just as a law enforcement, a police agency. They are carrying on backroom military tribunals of American civilians here in the United States today. In Ex parte Milligan, it was held that military tribunals could not try civilians in areas where civil courts were open, which we have today throughout the United States, even during times of war. And even with the issues of the war on terror or the war in Iraq or war upon Iraq, we still have our courts open, we still have our police functioning, we still have our fire department, we still have our hospitals, and individuals should not be tried, and their due process rights, which are constitutional rights, should not be violated by these actions. This is something that you need to look into a little bit more, and you can Google some of this stuff on the internet. It also held, and this is an important issue because you've heard a lot about habeas corpus that's been coming out in the last several years, the suspension of habeas corpus, because habeas corpus goes to the issue of these military tribunals and the suspension of habeas corpus. It also held that habeas corpus could only be suspended. That means that you could not go any further than that. You could arrest, detain, and then not prosecute or investigate, and only allowed for holding or detaining of citizens without charges, but not tried and certainly not executed by military tribunals. And this is something that happened in World War II, where, excuse me, 8 German saboteurs were captured, and Roosevelt went to go ahead and prosecute these individuals, and they were, and it created a really a bad precedence, and there's a lot of discussion about this even today. There's a report, it's called a CRS report from Congress. This was put out in 2002 about the Quirin incident or precedent that was set during World War II about trying the saboteurs, because one of them was actually a U.S. citizen, much like what we're having today with the Muslims and individuals in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. You can find this also on the internet. This is still a controlling case. It is also held that habeas corpus could only be suspended and not allowed for holding or detaining of citizens without charges, but not tried and certainly not executed by military tribunals. Military jurisdiction had been strictly limited and bound tightly to only those who come under direct control of military law. And this is important. If you're in the Navy, then the military law for the Navy, you get prosecuted through their system of internal military law for the Navy. They have their own JAG Corps and more. If you're in the Coast Guard, which is supposedly or allegedly a branch of military, then it would be for Coast Guard personnel only, and it would be Coast Guard personnel who would prosecute these individuals for what should be minor crimes, because if we have our courts functioning, these individuals are still citizens and should still gain access to our Article 3 courts. But what has happened is the Article 2 proceedings that are supposed to be remedial in nature only and administrative and for minor offenses, and to the point where, especially for military tribunals, are only supposed to be carried on in extraordinary circumstances, like in the middle of a war on the battlefield. And even much of the things that are going on in Iraq, whether it be Blackwater, the mercenary troops, or our own troops, they should still have the right to independent judiciary, and the military itself should not be trying its own people. These are larger issues that go into this. It goes into the issues of conflicts of interest, but more importantly, the military, any branch of military, whether it's the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, or any others, and if you want to include the Coast Guard as a branch of military, as they allege themselves that they are, a special one at that, they should only be prosecuting their own personnel, U.S. Coast Guard personnel who are paid by the U.S. Coast Guard, and no one else, especially civilians, because what they're doing is not only violating due process, they're denying civilians the rights that they would have in these proceedings themselves to JAG counsel or Judge Advocate General counsel to assist them in the proceedings. This important case ruled that the suspension of habeas corpus by President Abraham Lincoln was unconstitutional. This is very important, as the issue of habeas corpus is tied to the issues of military tribunals, as is the issue of what was focused on in the Act of Congress in Posse Comitatus that outlawed the use of military as a police force. And that's where the bar is. And there's been cases even in Korea that went to a woman. It's Reed versus Covert. It's a U.S. Supreme Court case. And it was a woman serving, or not serving, her husband was serving in England. She was the spouse of, she was not in the military. She killed her husband. She was prosecuted, grabbed by the military, prosecuted in a military tribunal overseas, brought back here into the United States. She was actually put in a brig. She was found guilty, put in prison for life. The U.S. Supreme Court got wind of this and actually got the case before them, and she was released, not only because of the issues of extraterritorial, where it happened out of the United States, but because her due process rights had been so violated by the military prosecuting her within a military tribunal. There's many other case laws on this, and I ask you to go to the internet and start researching some of this, because it's going on today, and there is a long history to this. The North used the military to impose itself upon the South after the Civil War was over. The act was passed, which is Posse Comitatus, after Reconstruction and prohibits under federal law 18 U.S.C. 1385 and was passed on June 16, 1878. The act prohibits most members of federal uniformed services, Army, Navy, Air Force, State National Guards, when such are called into federal service, from exercising nominally state law enforcement, police or peace officer powers that maintain law and order and are on non-federal property, states, their counties, and municipal divisions in the former, and this was at that time in Confederate states, but it still applies today. I want to keep getting through this because this goes into, and you can look in not only the Alien and Sedition Act, but also the Insurrection Act. These are the laws, and they're laws that were, some of them were set up just shortly after the Revolutionary War, some between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and some surrounding the Civil War, which were targeted at, and even in the early 1900s, which were targeted at American civilians. And it was allowing the military to step in and carry on civilian law enforcement. The statute generally prohibits fielded military personnel and units of the United States National Guard as well when under federal authority from acting in a law enforcement capacity within the United States, except where expressly authorized by the Constitution or Congress. And we've had the Warner Defense Authorization Bill, and Warner has been a big advocate and attacking Posse Comitatus for some time. He does not have a problem in using the military to carry on law enforcement upon civilians. Also, the Military Commissions Act, and you can look these up on the internet, the H.R. 1955, which was just passed, and also SB, it's a Senate bill, 1959. And many of these bills are targeted at American civilians to where rather than gaining and maintaining your rights, which are constitutional rights and protections, to access to the independent judiciary, Article 3, they are carrying on trials, tribunals, military commissions within Article 2 proceedings of civilians. And this is just, it's unbelievable. And this is something that you need to be aware of and start to research and begin to confront. Call your congressmen, senators, write them, email them, and look into these issues and start to explore them and research them yourself a little bit better. We'll get a little bit more into the Coast Guard in part 4 of this series and some of the corruptions, and much of it surrounds around the issue that the Coast Guard, that is supposed to be a civil service in times of peace, and then becomes an arm of the military only under the Department of Navy, and this is in a declared war by Congress, not as in Iraq where it has been not a declared war by Congress, but there is authorization to use military force, and there's a big difference between the two. And again, this is something that you can and should look up and start to research on the internet. It is said that the Coast Guard is exempt from Posse Comitatus Act, which is not true. The Coast Guard was not around when Posse Comitatus was enacted. Posse Comitatus was enacted in 1878, and Coast Guard was not created until 1915. Also shortly after that, in 1946-47, the Uniform Code of Military Justice was passed, which was to apply to all uniformed regular branches of the military to make the codes of military law that they came under uniform for them so that it applied equally the same whether they were in the Air Force, the military, the Navy, Marine Corps. And this did not include the Coast Guard because the Coast Guard was at that time, and even now is argued, a civil service in times of peace and only becomes a branch of military under the U.S. Navy in a time of war. And part of the problem, if you start looking into the creation of the national security cutters that they've just come out with, and there's huge problems with this, not only in corruption in building the cutters, but a lot of this goes to the mission of what the Coast Guard is and is supposed to be doing, and we'll get into that here shortly as to the creation of the Coast Guard in 1915. It may have been true at the time only because when the Coast Guard was not under the U.S. Navy in a time of declared war, it was a civilian civil service or agency and not a branch of military. This is important as this is one of the other issues or core issues that has risen today when the Coast Guard is declaring itself to be a special branch of military. And the reason they throw out special is that somehow posse comitatus does not apply. And I ask you to go to the internet, go to Wikipedia, learn about posse comitatus and learn why it's there. It's important because it does protect you from coming underneath a military tribunal, which you should not. You will be at odds when you step before a military tribunal as a civilian. The history in all of this and numerous changes have not been more fully analyzed and kept in order and in keeping with controlling decisions of the Supreme Court and companion legislation for the U.S. Merchant Marine and other agencies that are companions to the U.S. Coast Guard and are not part of the U.S. Coast Guard that affect more direct legislation regarding the Coast Guard as well. At the time posse comitatus was passed, there was no Coast Guard, so to speak, and the Coast Guard was not considered in the passing of the act, and for anyone to put that forth is a stretch of the imagination. The Coast Guard did not come into existence until 37 years later. Posse comitatus, as I said, was passed in 1878, and the act that formed the Coast Guard from the combination of other existing agencies, including most notably the Revenue Cutter Service, which was a civil service, was part of the Treasury Department, was passed in 1915. And importantly, this was in the middle of World War I. And one thing that the Coast Guard has tried to do is equate that it's a uniformed, and they took on the uniform voluntarily. This was not passed by Congress, and that was under the Life-Saving Service. And armed service somehow is a branch of military. Well, your police are armed and uniformed, but they're not a branch of military. And this is being intentionally construed so that the Coast Guard can sell weapons interdiction platforms like Coast Guard cutters, drones, helicopters, missiles, depleted uranium in the form of munitions in the in-close weapon systems, the phalanx, that fire 3,500 rounds per minute. They're loading these on the Coast Guard vessels now. These are Navy weapons, and they're weaponizing and militarizing the Coast Guard, which is kind of dangerous because you may, if you have a sailboat or a yacht or anything else, you may come into contact with this new militarized branch of service. The history in all of this and numerous changes have not been more fully analyzed and kept in order in keeping with the controlling decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court, as I said. The Posse Comitatus Act, I'm going through this real quick, the only reason the Revenue Cutter Service was not included in the Posse Comitatus Act, as I said, it was an independent agency and was locally controlled, more importantly, by the custom houses. This was not through central planning or federal government in Washington. What Hamilton did when the service was set up was he actually built the first 10 vessels in the Revenue Cutter Marine and turned them over to the local custom houses so that they were actually controlled, and they got their shipping orders from the local custom house and not from D.C. And this went to a big difference in change where we have much more central planning going on here in the United States now, much more like the former Soviet Union, and some would say communism, rather than keeping the power and authority with the local folk, for want of a better term. It did not, and as I said, it did not exist under federal or military control except in a position of a declared war. And many times the Coast Guard did come under the authority of the U.S. Navy up until more recently with these changes in Homeland Security. And I put forth to you that these are not good changes. These are not beneficial to the American people, and they put us on a more permanent war footing rather than maintaining this as a civil service as it should be. The Insurrection Act was also passed in 1807, and this is important. Please go to the internet and look up the Insurrection Act. But well prior to the Posse Comitatus Act in 1878, the Insurrection Act was passed to limit, control, and regulate by Congress the powers of the President to deploy troops in the United States to put down insurrection, lawlessness, and rebellion. The general aim was to limit presidential powers as much as possible, relying on state and local governments for initial response in the event of insurrection. Coupled eventually with the Posse Comitatus Act, presidential powers for law enforcement are limited and delayed. And this is intentional. But much of this has changed since 9/11, since the events of September 11, 2001 that occurred at the World Trade Center and at the Pentagon and in Pennsylvania. The Warner Defense Authorization Bill of 2007, this is important, please look it up on the internet, altered the ability of the president to deploy troops, in fact increasing his ability to do so. But the limitations barring trials is of the most fundamental nature, as it goes well beyond police powers. And this is what's going on. They're not just using police powers to arrest and detain and restore order and then turn people over for, if necessary, a trial, and then allow civilian authorities to even bring the charges. This is exactly what the U.S. Coast Guard is now attempting to do from under internal changes within its structure to be able to, on behalf of some would say foreign and even domestic or private concerns, prosecute American civilians and even naval officers from other and more true and proper branches of the military as well as civilians. This wraps up pretty much part 3. In part 4, we're going to get into a few more of the issues with the current changes in the legislation, and then jump into some of the problems that are popping up, and I've mentioned many of them in the first 3 shows, which goes to creation of these national security cutters that are not for Coast Guard, which is here in the United States and guarding our coast, but it's to create the Coast Guard as an international maritime police, to have a de facto Navy in the form of the Coast Guard backing up the U.S. Navy. And it's not real clear how much the U.S. Navy is involved or allowing this, but it would seem that the U.S. Navy would be extremely concerned with what is going on and start to investigate and push the Coast Guard back into being a civil service in times of peace and under a declared war by Congress, under the direct authority of the U.S. Navy as they should be. We'll get more into this in show 4, and hopefully if you can take the time to go to the internet, I would advise that you do it. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening, and we'll move into show 4, part 4.
Questions of much graver and universal interest occupy our minds today.